Let me invite you to turn your Bibles with me to the 27th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. I'm going to be out of the pulpit for the next 3 weeks, taking the family on vacation. Then I'm going to be preaching at some friends' churches after that. But I've just loved this study of 1 Samuel so much that I wanted to get at least one more sermon in before I have to go. The story of chapter 27 reminded me of a story that took place back in June of 1944. It was in June of 1944 that some 13,000 of our soldiers parachuted into France as a part of the D-Day operation. And one of those soldiers was a private named John Steele. He was part of the 82nd Airborne Division. And as John jumped out of his plane, he immediately knew that he was in trouble because the winds began carrying him and many of his fellow soldiers away from their intended drop zones and towards a small French village known as Saint-Marie-Igles, where there was a panicked German garrison that was machine gunning all the stray invaders and actually trying to burn the town to the ground. And then what was even worse than that, as John Steele continued his descent, his parachute got caught on the steeple of the local church. And so he reached for his knife and somehow dropped it, and it's clattered to the ground. And so there he was. This is the church, and I don't know if they leave that up there all the time, but that's kind of an example of what it looked like. John Steele just suspended from the steeple, no way to get down, no way to fight, and so he found himself in something of a predicament. He was supposed to be making war on the Germans, but in the moment, he decided that his only real option was to do something totally counterintuitive. To stop flailing about and to simply pretend like he was dead in the hopes that he wouldn't actually end up dead eventually. And so for 2 hours, as the fires raged around him, as the streets were filled with gunfire, John Steele hung lifeless, suspended from that church steeple. Eventually, the Germans did get around to going up there to get him down, and much to their surprise, they found that he was very much alive. And so they took him as a captive of war. He was actually eventually able to escape, and it's just an amazing story. He was in a bad place. He was in a really bad place, and yet somehow the Lord was able to get him out of that whole thing. Well, that is not at all unlike what we're going to find in 1 Samuel chapter 27. If you remember, David has been on the run all the way since chapter 18. He has had close encounter after close encounter after close encounter with Saul. He's run as far to the east as he could possibly go. He's living up there with the ibex in the middle of nowhere, but Saul simply will not leave him alone. And what's more than that, something that we haven't talked about before, but it's almost certain that David had at least another 1,000 people out there in the wilderness that he was taking care of. He had his family, he had 600 men, he had their families. He might have had as many as 2,000 to 3,000 people, women and children, that he was responsible for out there in the desert. And so, like John Steele, David finds himself in chapter 27, he finds himself in a really bad predicament. He's in quite a situation. And so coming into chapter 27, what's going to happen is David is going to decide that he just can't do this anymore, that something's got to change. And it seems totally counterintuitive, but he decided that his only real option was to go to Gath again to finally get away from Saul and to try to make the best out of a bad situation. Now, you'll notice as we're going through chapter 27, there's a lot of ambiguity in this chapter. It's a difficult chapter, not to understand. It's actually very straightforward to understand. But if we approach this chapter like a jury trying to put David on trial for his actions here, I'll tell you, it is hard to come up with a verdict. I listened to a number of different preachers this last week just to see what they had to say. Alistair Begg thinks that David is just guilty as guilty can be, that this was a massive, massive flaw in his character. And gosh, who am I to disagree with, Alistair Begg of all people? I read other guys that think the other way, and it's tough. And you're going to see how tough it is as we go through it. But one way or the other, in chapter 27, David goes to Gath again. Let's pick up the story in verse 1, where David flees to Gath. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. And then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hands." Now, it's been a few weeks since we were in chapter 26, but you might remember that something about that sounds somewhat familiar. If you look at chapter 26 and verse 19, this was the last encounter that David had with Saul. David says in verse 19, "Now, therefore, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is Yahweh who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before Yahweh." And here's the part. "For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of Yahweh, saying, 'Go serve other gods.'" I think David kind of saw this coming. He knew he was already living just on the extremities of Israelite life. I think he already, somewhere in the back of his mind, knew that there might come a point where I'm just going to have to get out of town, where I'm going to have to actually leave the land of Israel because I have myself to think about, and more importantly, I have thousands of people who are dependent upon me, women and children. We just can't keep doing this. I think it's almost like David, he held on as long as he could, living on the very outer reaches of society. But with his last encounter with Saul in chapter 26, he realized that something's just got to change. We can't keep doing this. And I do think it's an indication of just how desperate David finds himself. In order to get out of this pathological game of hide and seek with Saul, David is going to have to go seek refuge with the Philistines, with his enemies. That's how bad things have gotten for David. Well, then look at verse 2. "So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of Gath." And you probably remember, we've been here before. This is Israelite territory, the territory of Judah, if you kind of the lower half of the screen there. And then there's a dividing line that you can see. And beyond that dividing line, you're in Philistine territory. That's where Gath is at right there. Just to give you an even better kind of a map visual of it, Ziph down here on the bottom right, that's where David has been. Way out there in the wilderness, the very kind of edge of existence out there. Saul lives in Gibeah, right there to the north. Gath is over there to the left. That's Philistine territory. And then all the way down there on the bottom is Ziklag, which was going to become important here in a minute. But that's more or less kind of where all of this happened at. Gath was about 30 rugged miles from Ziph, where David is living at right now, where he's been camping out. And just imagine with me, just for a moment, the logistics of that. There's no easy way to get to Gath from Ziph. And especially when you take into account that David has at least 1,000 people to move to Gath, and that Saul, while he did say he wasn't going to hunt David any longer, he hasn't exactly been known as a man of his word. And so we have to move that many people over to Gath. Just the logistical nightmare of moving women and children that far, it's a nightmare to even imagine. This is ultimately where they're going to end up. This is biblical Gath right here. We can go in a little bit further. This is Tel Gath. That's where you can go today. It still is in existence. It's a place that you can visit. Now, if you remember, turn back in your Bibles to chapter 21. Just kind of by way of reminder, we've done this before. Do you remember this? We've done this before. In chapter 21, David tried the same thing Although at this point he was all by himself. He knew he had to get away from Saul, so he went to Gath. He tried to hide himself as something of a lone mercenary. In verse 10 it says, "And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish," same guy, "the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s.' And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard." And I love this part. "Then Achish said to his servants, 'Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?'" And he let David go. And David went to the cave of Adullam, and that's when he starts to gather this cohort around him. So we've done this before. Last time, David was by himself, and this was very fresh, the rift between David and Saul. And so Achish and the bureaucrats around him, they rightly assumed that David was still working for Saul, that something's going on here that we don't want to get involved in. But it's been months since then. And Achish now knows that David is Saul's mortal enemy. How did he know that? Well, I think everyone in Israel knew that. Everyone knew. In this whole region, David, he's an outlaw. He's a usurper. Saul had sent thousands and thousands of men out into the wilderness to try to find this guy to get his head. Everyone knew that the Philistines were even able to time their raids into Israelite territory based on Saul's pursuit of David, because they knew he and all of his men would be out there in the wilderness, and so now we can come up and go take what we want from the people. If you remember in chapter 23, in verse 27, David is running away from Saul. They're on one side of the mountain, Saul's on the other side of the mountain, and the Philistines had timed their raid just perfectly where Saul would not be able to stop them. So everyone knew what was going on. And so at this point, knowing that David and Saul are so estranged from one another, and David's collected around himself a pretty decent mercenary force, and that might be a nice little kind of a mini army to keep at hand. If nothing else, they'll probably enrich him by giving him a little piece of the spoil that they take. Achish says, "Well, sure. Well, you can move in with me." Incidentally, this is just kind of another interesting piece of history. This is the oldest Philistine tablet that has been discovered. It's the oldest, this is actual Philistine writing here. It's from the 7th century BC. And that part there in red that you see, that's the name Achish. Isn't that interesting? It seems like it was, possibly a dynastic name, or it might have just been a very, very common name, but we have, outside of the Bible, we have other records of this Philistine name, Achish. Okay, back to chapter 27. So David goes, verse 3, "And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household." That's we know how large this group is. "And David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him." And so it worked. David probably got the first good night's sleep that he'd had in months and months and months. But it does beg the question, was it right for David to flee to Gath? Was it right for David to flee to Gath? Does it betray something of a lack of faith in Yahweh? Yahweh had delivered him time and time again. Couldn't he have just kept it up, stayed there? Was it right for David to flee to Gath? The author doesn't seem to give an opinion on it. Either way, it's really interesting. You read through the whole chapter, and there's other things in this chapter that are somewhat questionable, and the author, it's like he balances the story that he's telling and makes it exceedingly difficult to come to any kind of a judgment. It's true, David probably could have stayed in the wilderness. He could have continued playing cat and mouse with Saul, and Yahweh certainly would have protected him. There's no doubt about that. But David had a family to think about. David had at least 1,000 other people, women and children, that he was responsible for. And again, don't miss the fact that it worked, that they are now safe. They have found refuge. So was it right for David to flee to Gath? And to be perfectly honest, I don't know. It's a vexing question. Commentators and preachers, they spend a lot of time trying to wrestle through that and kind of weigh out the morality of it. As for me, like my conclusion, I don't know if there is a right answer to this question. I think that this story is a good reminder that sometimes the people of God are faced with very difficult choices. Sometimes following God means facing questions that no one else has to face. And somehow, just in the integrity of your own heart, trying to figure it out. Sometimes there is no clear answer about which way you should go. What I think the story is teaching us is that in some sense, when you're faced with one of those really ambiguous situations and it's unclear what you should do, in some sense, it doesn't really matter. I think you just do the best you can. You make the decision that seems to make the most sense to you, and you do so with the confidence that one way or the other, God's going to work it out. Because that's what's going to happen here. The Lord's going to work this whole thing out. I think David probably could have stayed in the wilderness. For him, in that situation, he felt like the best thing was to go to Gath. Either way, like, God's got it. And so there's something of a peace or a confidence we can have with that. We too are faced with ambiguous decisions at times. How should you educate your children? Oh, now we're really starting to meddle. How should you educate your children? Should you send them to the public school? Should you send them to the Christian school? Should you homeschool? Should you send them to cool classes? That's the one I happen to prefer, but you can do whatever you want. Is there a right answer to that? Is there one way that this is the will of God, and if I miss it, if I don't quite get it there, then everything else in their lives will be off kilter and it'll never work out, and they'll start doing drugs and move to San Francisco, and it all comes down to this one decision. Can I just free you that that's not true? It doesn't matter. Make the best decision that you can. God is more than capable of taking care of your kids, however that works itself out. How should you care for aging parents? That's a vexing question. Because your parents are older, does that mean that they have to move in with you? Oh, Lord. Now we're moving into meddling, right? Is it okay for them to be in a care facility of some sort? I don't know. You've got to figure that out for yourself. But you can do so with the confidence that you do the best that you can, and the Lord will work out the details, just like he does for David, even when he moves to Gath. I don't think that you can indict David on this charge. I just really don't. I love Alistair Begg, but I really think he's wrong here. Don't tell him I said that. But I think David was a man in a really tough situation, and he made the best decision that he could. So that's verses 1 through 4. David flees to Gath. In verses 5 through 7, David, as quickly as he could, he moved to Ziklag. Verses 5 through 7, David moves to Ziklag. Look at verse 5. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, oops, I'm in the wrong chapter. Sorry. Chapter 27, verse 5. Oh, that's going to be a good story, though. That's the Witch of Endor. Oh, my. You're going to have to wait like about a month for that, but it has nothing to do with Star Wars. It's going to be amazing. All right. Chapter 27, verse 5 is where we are. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, then let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? This Gath, this is very, very metropolitan, and it's pretty highfalutin for simple folk like us. Why don't you just let me move out to the country somewhere? And so what David is doing is he's flattering Achish on one hand, and he's also probably feeding into a need that Achish had noticed. Just think about the arrival of a group of that size, at least 1,000, maybe a couple thousand of people in a town like Gath. It would have put a tremendous strain on the town's resources. All of a sudden, there's 1,000 people that need fresh water, and they don't have plumbing. So where do you get fresh water? You've got to haul it up. There's 1,000 people who need to buy food. There's 1,000 people that need places to sleep. So Achish is in a little bit of a situation here, and this idea of moving to Ziklag is actually a pretty great idea. So David tells him, look, we'd be much better off in a small town somewhere way out in the countryside, way far away from Gath, where you can't keep an eye on what we're actually up to. And this gives you an idea of where Ziklag is in relation to Gath. So David's up there, kind of top left in Gath. And it's basically a straight shot 20 miles south, and you end up in the biblical city of Ziklag. And it was a perfect place for David to be. It was far away from Saul. Saul's not coming down to Ziklag, that's for sure. And it's far enough away from Achish where he's not really going to have his eyes on David to keep an eye on what he's up to. And this is the most likely location of biblical Ziklag. It's called Tel Sarah. That's from a distance. You get a little bit closer here. You go in a little bit further. And that's where Ziklag is. That's where David actually moved his family and all of his people to, in Ziklag. Well, that takes us to verse 7. Then Saul said to his servants, nope, still in the wrong chapter. Verse 7. And the name of the days, and the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. 16 months David was down there living in Ziklag. Now, something interesting about Ziklag in particular. Ziklag was one of the cities that God had given to the Israelites as a part of the conquest, but it was a city that they never took possession of. Over in Joshua chapter 15 and verse 31, it lists Ziklag specifically as a city that belongs to Judah. And so I think what you have here in David then taking Ziklag from Achish, I think what you have is a wonderful example of David, again, making the best out of a bad situation. David would have much rather been in Israel. He would have much rather been at home where the tabernacle was at. He must have hated the fact that he was constantly on the run from Saul. And I'm sure that the sight of the Philistine temples and the debauchery of the Philistine people must have just made David sick. But for whatever reason, God had put him where he was. And so he decided to just make the best out of it and to do what he could for Yahweh, even in Gath, while he was stuck in Philistine territory. And he was even able to regain a small part of Israel's inheritance by just being faithful and doing what he could. And again, I just think that that's a really good reminder to each and every one of us that wherever it is that God may have placed you in this world, in this life, you should try to do what you can for Yahweh in that place. Maybe you're here this morning and your marriage isn't quite what it's supposed to be. And I get it. I've done a lot of marriage counseling. I know how hard it can be. I know that at times it can seem absolutely hopeless. But But what if you just resolved in your heart of hearts to do what you could do for the Lord, even in that difficult relationship? That you just decided, I'm just going to be faithful to Yahweh here. I'm going to do what I can for him. Who knows what he might do with that? I think that's what David is doing here. He's in a bad situation, but he figured, I'll just do what I can for the Lord, and I'll reclaim this little bitty, in the middle of nowhere town, because that's basically all I can do right now. What if you did that in your relationship with your spouse? Or maybe it's your job. Maybe you just hate where you work, and it's just a kind of a misery to go there every day and to be amongst the Philistines, so to speak. And again, I get it, and it's getting harder and darker in our society every single day. But again, what if you just did what you could for Yahweh? What if you just decided that whatever happens, I'm just going to do what I can to serve the Lord in this place? And who knows what he might do? The point is, be faithful where God has planted you, and trust him that he knows what he's doing. Wherever God's planted you, your relationships, your career, wherever he's planted you, be faithful there. Do what you can there. And just trust him that he knows what he's doing. So in verses 1 through 4, David flees to Gath. In verses 5 through 7, David moves to Ziklag. Now we get to the most difficult part of this story in verses 8 through 12, where David raids Israel's enemies to the south. Look at verse 8 with me. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive. I think we can presume children too. So in these raids, David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive. What are we supposed to make out of that? I don't know if this is David at his best here. I think I understand why David felt like this was necessary, and perhaps even justified. But I'm still not sure if this is David really at his best. Now, the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, these were all nomadic raiders who raided Israel out of the south. So they live in what's called the Negev. This is the wilderness. They all live down in this area. And these are the enemies of Israel. There's no doubt. These are the enemies of Israel. Kind of get more of an aerial view of the territory that we're talking about here. We don't know a lot about these tribes. We know the Geshurites are referred to in Joshua chapter 13 and verse 2. It says, this is the land that yet remains, all the regions of the Philistines and all those of the Geshurites. So this is a nomadic tribe living to the south, Israel's enemies. The Girzites, we don't have any record whatsoever of these Girzites, but I think we can probably safely assume that they too are a southern tribe of raiders who are the enemies of Israel. But the Amalekites, we do know who the Amalekites were. This was the tribe that Yahweh had told Saul to go and absolutely annihilate completely. Turn over in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25, we get specific instructions about the Amalekites. So you remember the story. The Amalekites had attacked Israel when she was wandering through the wilderness. They had killed thousands of Israelites. And so in Deuteronomy 25, God tells Israel, in days to come, this is what you are to do to the Amalekites. So Deuteronomy 25, verse 17, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when Yahweh your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Remember, Yahweh told Saul, now is the time to go ahead and do that. And Saul had something of a half-hearted approach to it. And if you turn back just a few more pages to Deuteronomy to chapter 20, in verse 16, we get even more instructions about the conquest. This is the instructions to Israel for how they are to take over the land of Israel, this inheritance that God had given them. In Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 16, but in the cities of these people that Yahweh your God has given you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Incidentally, these three tribes are all clearly Canaanites. The Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Why? That they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against Yahweh your God. He had given them specific instructions in the context of the conquest to just wipe these people out. And so it may be that David saw himself as simply continuing the conquest of the land. This is territory that Israel had never taken, that they were supposed to have taken. And so he might have thought of himself as fulfilling Yahweh's commands to complete the conquest in the south. It could be that. But go back over to chapter 27. If you look at verse 11, it gives you a little more insight into David's heart. It says, and David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. And such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. So verse 11 tells us specifically that David did this. He just wiped these people out so that Achish wouldn't find out what he had done. So was David right for doing that or not? I don't know. It's a hard case. We know in 2 Samuel, David tells his prophet Nathan that he wants to build God a temple. And God ends up telling David, no. You will not build that temple. Your son will build that temple. And do you remember the reason why God told David no? Because he was a man of blood. Now, I don't know if God has had this in mind or not, but we do know that over the lifetime of David, he was very much a man of blood. He was a warrior, to be sure. So it's tough. He may have been justified here, but it's really hard to know what was in his heart, isn't it? You finish up verse 9, says, David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but he would take away the sheep. Excuse me, I lost my place. He would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and he would come back to Achish. So he's bringing, a part of this is a tribute that he brings back to Achish. It's kind of like his rent payment for Ziklag or something along those lines. Then it concludes in verses 10 and following. Then when Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negeb of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Jermelites, or against the Negeb of the Canaanites. These are all tribes, these are Jewish tribes, Israelite tribes to the north, when he's actually been going to the south. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, so David has done. Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking he has made himself an utter stench to his people, Israel. and therefore he shall always be my servant. So Achish thinks that David is attacking Israel, making Israel just hate him all the more, when in reality, David is attacking Israel's enemies to the south, making Israel love him all the more. So what do we do with a story like that? I think the author intentionally leaves us wondering about how we're supposed to understand this. It's so ambiguous, it seems intentional. On the one hand, David had over 1,000 mouths to feed. And these were Israel's enemies. And Moses does seem to authorize that kind of warfare. On the other hand, it does feel like David is kind of taking matters into his own hands here. It feels a little self-serving. It's hard to decide. And once again, I wonder if that's not the point. Every single one of us, at some point, every single one of us is going to encounter a situation in our life that is exceedingly difficult to sort out. What are you supposed to do when a child that you poured your heart and soul into wanders away from the Lord and breaks your heart? And then one day they call you up and they say, hey, I'd love to come up for Christmas. And she wants to bring her boyfriend with her and spend the week with you. What do? There's no easy answer to that question. If you think I know what to do, no, you don't. There's no easy answer to that question. There's quite a few different ways that you might think about that. There's quite a few different ways that you might try to navigate that. I was in the airport, I think this was last week, maybe it was a week before that. And we went to Starbucks before we got on the plane, just barely made the plane, but I had to have my latte. Like I would have skipped the flight to get my latte. But there was more pride, memorabilia, and decorations at this particular Starbucks than I had ever seen anyplace else. And I well, except for Target, but I don't go to Target anymore. Anyways, I wonder if all of these employees believe that. I mean, it's Starbucks, so they probably do. But what if there happened to be a Christian that worked there? What's that person supposed to do? That could be kind of an awkward situation. How do you navigate those waters? Pronouns now becoming such a popular, such a point of conflict in our society. What's the right answer to that? That's a hard question. I'm not really sure. I can't tell you in every single case how it's supposed to work out, because every single person in every situation is so unique. Those are hard questions. What do you do? Some of you have been facing this question recently. What do you do when a loved one tells you that he feels like a woman trapped in a man's body? Now, of course, you can't lie and affirm that. And of course, you should, at some point, try to find a way to speak the truth into that person's life. But between here and there, there's going to be a 1,000 different choices you've got to make about what kind of a text message you're going to send and what kind of a phone call you're going to have, and will you do this and will you do that, and how is that all going to work itself out? Bottom line is, it's a tough question. You're probably going to have to figure that out for yourself. Now, you need to take biblical principles with you, and they will guide you in your decision making. But there are a lot of cases like that. And chapter 27 is just such a great example of it. There are a lot of cases like that in each of our lives where it's not perfectly clear what the right thing to do is. And so I think we would all do well to remember the words of Jesus, who told us, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." As we do life together as a church family, there are certainly going to be times where one person makes a decision to handle a difficult situation in one way, and another person would have made a really different decision to handle it in a different way. And I'm just here to tell you, I think that that's okay. Sometimes it's enough for us to just step back and appreciate what a difficult position David found himself in. What a difficult position your friends, your family members, your loved ones are going to find themselves in. And to just trust that that person is going to have to rely on the Lord and figure it out for themselves, taking the principles of God's word and applying them the best way that they can to the difficult situation they find themselves in. That's not for everything. There are a lot of things in life that are quite clear, but chapter 27 is not. And that's why it reminds us that sometimes it's okay just to let other people live their lives and trust that they're relying on the Lord to get them through the hard things that they face. Let's pray. Father, I've wrestled with this chapter. It hasn't just been this week. It's been at least a month that I've been thinking about this. And it does seem to me that the struggle, the wrestling of it is at least part of the point. Every one of us will face difficult decisions. Maybe not about Gath and Philistine lords and raiding the south, but we're going to have tough things that we've got to figure out in our lives. And we should seek out wise counsel. We should talk to our pastors and elders. We certainly need to search out your word and see what it says. But God, we just recognize that there's going to be some things in life that we just have to walk by faith and make the best decision that we can on. And so, God, I thank you for this ambiguous story, for me, this terribly frustrating story, because I'd rather have it very clear. But it's good for all of us to be reminded that sometimes life's a little bit more complicated than we would like it to be. But through all of it, God, we just need to trust you. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 comes to mind. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. God, we certainly know that that's true in our lives. We see that in the life of David as this story progresses. And so I just pray that you'd help each of us to do that, to trust you with all of our hearts, even in the ambiguous, difficult decisions that we have to make in this life. For we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.